Romans chapter 15 and verse 21. But as it is written, to whom he was not spoken of, they shall see, and they that have not heard shall understand. Get with me, Isaiah 52:15. Isaiah chapter 52:15. We're going to see that Paul is again quoting the Old Testament. Isaiah 52:15. So shall he sprinkle many nations. The kings shall shut their mouths at him. For that which had not been told them shall they see, and that which they had not heard shall they consider. Romans 15:21 is quoting Isaiah 52:15. It's not a verbatim quotation. It's obviously a verbally equivalent quotation. And he's quoting that for the proposition that the gospel will be preached to the Gentiles. Now, Isaiah 52:15 doesn't foreshadow Paul's specific gospel, but it does teach that the gospel will be preached to the Gentiles. Go back to Romans 15:22. For which cause also I have been much hindered from coming to you. Get 1 Thessalonians 2:18. Now, while you're turning to 1 Thessalonians 2:18, let me ask you this question. What was Paul's thorn in the flesh? So 2 Corinthians 12 talks about Paul's thorn in the flesh, and it says that it's the messenger of Satan. So if you believe what 2 Corinthians 12 says, what was Paul's thorn in the flesh? It was a messenger of Satan. Now you can decide whether this is true or not. Here's the image I have in my mind. When Paul leaves Galatia, and he writes the book of Galatians, what he says in Galatians 1 is, I marvel, I'm shocked, that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. In other words, what Paul is saying is, look, guys, I haven't been gone that long. And yet you're already removed from me unto another gospel. Now, 2 Corinthians 12 said Paul's thorn was the messenger of Satan. So think with me just for a moment. Let's say that you're Satan, and you realize that Paul has been given the dispensation of grace. Satan is going to be a counterfeiter, right? He's going to have some reaction to what God is doing. Well, isn't the most logical thing the following? If Paul's the apostle of the Gentiles, and he's going to travel around preaching the gospel, and you're Satan, and you want to oppose that, then you need your own guy. And what he should do is he should follow Paul's travel one step behind. Should he be there at the same time Paul is? The reason he shouldn't be at the same time as Paul is Moses and the magicians. What happened with Moses and the magicians? Well, Moses throws down his staff and it can become a serpent. And the magicians say, oh, that's just a trick. We can do the same thing. We'll throw ours down and they'll become a serpent. What happens? What does Moses' staff do? It eats them. So if you're there and you see that demonstration, who's the real one and who's not? Moses was. So if you're Satan and you have a messenger of Satan, what 2 Corinthians 12 calls Paul's thorn in the flesh, you don't really want your guy in the same place with Paul, because if they have a standoff, which one of those is going to be validated by the Holy Spirit? Paul would be. So what you do is you have your guy outside Galatia, you wait for Paul to leave, and then when Paul leaves, you come in and you try to tear up doctrinally what he was doing. Now, you can decide whether I'm making that up or that's what those verses are saying, but it is very fascinating that Paul's thorn in the flesh, and it's amazing to me, this is just how it is. You've heard people say, never let truth get in the way of a good story. Well, what Christians do is never let verses get in the way of what I want to think. So people say all sorts of crazy things about the thorn in the flesh. 2 Corinthians 12 specifically says it's the messenger of Satan. It defines it as that. So if you go with what it says, then the implication is that Satan responded to Paul's proclamation of the truth by, here's my guy that I'm going to use to tear up what you're doing. Now look with me at 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 18. Wherefore, we would have come unto you, even I, Paul, once and again, notice this, but Satan hindered us. Now, when Satan hindered Paul, did he like invisibly grab Paul by the ankle and like sort of like you can't go anywhere? Or did Satan hinder Paul working through people to prevent him from doing what he wanted to do? It's the latter, isn't it? And so as Paul is traveling, does he encounter all kinds of opposition from people that are doing Satan's bidding? I think the answer is yes. So when in Romans 15:22, Paul says, for which cause also I have been much hindered from coming to you. Well, who did the hindering? Satan did the hindering, and he did it through people where those people would obstruct, would interfere with Paul traveling where he wanted to travel. Go back with me to Romans 15:23. We're almost done. Romans 15:23. But now, having no more place in these parts, and having a great desire these many years to come unto you. So Paul says, but now having no more place in these parts. The idea is that Paul has preached the gospel in that area, and now it's time for him to move on to the next area. Now, when Paul says, but now having no more place in these parts, what is he referring to when he says in these parts? What's he talking about? Get with me, Romans 16, verse 23. The question that I think we're asking is, where is Paul when he writes Romans? Because when he says having no more place in these parts, he's talking about where he is. So where is he? Look at Romans 16:23. Gaius, mine host, and of the whole church, saluteth you. Erastus, the chamberlain of the city, saluteth you, and Quartus, a brother. Now, I'll leave this as your homework. You have to find a place in the scriptures where Gaius, mine host, where there's a Gaius that Paul would have stayed with. Then Erastus is the chamberlain of the city that is, and Quartus, a brother. I'm going to tell you what I think it is. He's talking about Corinth. The book of Romans is written in Acts chapter 20, verse 3. I can spend the time to prove that today, but that's the case. And it's written while he is in Corinth. So in Acts 20, verse 3, when Paul is in Corinth, he writes the book of Romans, and the book of Romans is then sent to Rome. When he says, now having no more place in these parts, he is saying, I have fully preached the gospel in this area. Given that he's the apostle of the Gentiles, I now have to then go on the next step on my journey and then travel to the next city and do the same thing again. Now, in Romans 15:23, he says this, and having a great desire these many years to come unto you. So Romans is written in Acts 20, verse 3, but Paul's had a desire before that time, right? Because he's had this great desire these many years. Look with me at Acts 19, verse 21. Now, while you're turning there are 6 epistles that Paul writes during the book of Acts. In other words, he writes Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Romans. Those are all written during the Acts period. There's then a number of epistles that Paul writes Acts 28 or later, the rest of his epistles. Whenever you're reading an epistle written during the Acts period, you should use the information typically in the first chapter and the last chapter. Sometimes it's in other places, but those are two of the most common. You should look at those facts and details and understand where you are in the book of Acts and understand what's going on. So I'm going to give you an example of that in Acts 19:21. Look at Acts 19 and verse 21. After these things were ended, Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. So when we were in Romans 15:23, and Paul said, and having a great desire these many years to come unto you, well, when did Paul first have that desire where he wanted to go into Rome? Well, when you read through the book of Acts and you pay close attention to what's going on, it seems at least by Acts 19:21, possibly earlier, but at least by that point, did Paul have a great desire to go to Rome to see the Roman saints? And the answer is yes, he did.